take it away.
All right, thank you, Patrick. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everybody for being here today. I'm really happy to be part of the Oklahoma Archivists Association Summer Series, and I'm glad to see so many of you here today. I know we're moving to a lot of digital media preservation, but paper is still hanging around in a lot of offices. So I'm happy to see that you're interested to hear about some preservation activities you can undergo with your paper. So I'm going to chat for a minute. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures on some slides, and then I'm going to be a little more interactive and show you some things that I have here in the room with me. And I would love to hear your questions, and I would love to talk with you about specific situations if you have them. So feel free to raise your hand either with the Zoom hand raise function, or just kind of interrupt me is also fine, because I'll just keep talking if you don't. So without further ado, I will go ahead and start the slides by sharing my screen. So I'm calling my presentation today Preservation While Processing. And the reason for that is because when you're processing a collection, you have everything out, you're touching it, you're looking at it, you're handling it. And hopefully once you put it in that box again, you're not going to get it out until it's time for a researcher to explore and use that collection. So when you're going over the materials initially, it's good to consider the preservation needs. And if you have the time and if you have the space, and I'm going to help you figure out how to determine if you have the supplies, it's really a good idea to go ahead and just do those activities at the time you have all those records out. So Patrick was kind enough to email out a handout which talks about some of the enemies of paper. It also has a little disclaimer, so to speak, at the beginning about just definitions. So actually, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute because I'm just still talking. Hi. So the definitions part, I think, is really important to discuss because preservation and conservation are two vastly different experiences for a paper item. And what we're going to talk about today is preservation. And I like to compare that preservation is an apartment building, whereas conservation is a hospital. And so we're here to ensure that there's lights and plumbing and electricity and all of the things that paper needs to live and be happy, not performing surgery or doing any life-saving techniques that will forever alter that item. So those definitions of preservation and conservation are important to look at as we get started with this discussion, so you know exactly where we're headed and what we're talking about. Everything that I'm going to discuss today is and should always be 100% reversible and never permanently altering the item. I'm going to leave that work to conservators, which are trained in a very detailed field that involves science and chemistry and things that we're not going to talk about at all today. So there are some great people in our region that do this work, and Rebecca Elder is one of them. I'm going to give a shout out to her because I've learned so much from her in the years past. She has a business called Elder Cultural Heritage Preservation out of Austin, Texas, and she teaches a slew of wonderful workshops, including one on enclosures, which I was lucky enough to attend last fall. So OAA and sometimes through the ORAB will also offer scholarships to these workshops or free, hopefully. We're looking at doing those again in 2024, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested in further training on how to build enclosures, make your own phase boxes, and that type of thing. So with that being out of the way, yeah, I'm not even half the box builder that Rebecca is. I'm going to show you a few things that I've done, but it's nothing to the degree of what she can do. So basics about paper and paper products. I'm going to go back now to show you the slides because there's some reasons why it's important to be cognizant of the housing and the living conditions essentially for your paper items. So paper is just inherently acidic. It's part of what makes up the chemical composition of the item. Wood pulp has lignin in it and cellulose, and together those things break down and they become acidic. It's basically oxidizing, which is just like rusting. And that's why the discoloration occurs. So what you're seeing in front of you is the cover, is an open cover of a booklet. And on the left side is the inside of that cover, which is highly acidic. And the first page has a lower acidity. And so it made it entirely brown. The one little square that's flapped over was another piece of paper that was sitting in between the cover and that first sheet. So the lighter square is not affected as heavily because it had a barrier of another piece of paper. And I'm showing this to give an example of how easy it is to protect paper from each other. So while I did have a small list of things on that document that show, the enemies of paper are light, water, pests. They can also be their neighbors. So it depends on what type of items are housed together in a folder. And if you have things that are of different pH, which I'm going to go through a folder here in a minute, we'll look at some examples of that. But this is what happens when something that is more acidic than its neighbor is next door, and it can also leach onto the page next to it. And it is called acid migration. And the next example is why paper clips are bad. So they are made of metal, of course, and just like paper oxidizes, metal, if coming into contact with any sort of moisture, will also rust. So you're seeing an example of a rusty paper clip, which has turned this really nice old document into red and rusty mess. On the opposite, the other image is showing a more dramatic example of when a rusty paper clip actually will just make that whole piece of the document tear away. And this is not uncommon to see with fasteners of any shape or size, that it can totally take out the paper that is in between the parts of that fastener. So metal fasteners aren't great. Plastic isn't much better. Too many clips. If you pile up a whole bunch of plastic clips together on one side, you make a mountain of plastic clips. And there's really not a lot of help that is happening with this. These documents are all in the folder together. So if you need to segregate something, I'm going to show you some ways to avoid needing to have all of this bulk in your folder. And if it's 100% necessary, I'll talk about options to flatten that out as well. So in addition to being too big, sometimes things can be too small. And this is an example of not enough material inside of a box. And so as you can see, the folders are not only too short for this box, but it's not filling it up. And so the folders are slumping, it's curved at the bottom, and those documents will forever have a wave in them unless you take action to flatten them out. And that requires a lot of time and attention. So better to have proper housing in the first place. Adhesive damage. This is a little fuzzy and I'm sorry for that, but I liked this image because it shows not only the damage the tape is doing to the cover, the title page of this book, but it's showing the adhesive sticking to the front cover as well. And so it's a great example of the damaging power of tape. Tape is no one's friend in an archive, and it doesn't matter even if it's archival document mending tape. I wouldn't trust it, quite honestly. A bookbinding situation is much different than loose documents. So we will be just talking about loose documents today. But this is an example of just showing what a pressure tape can do to an item. And that's just because the adhesive, the chemical makeup of the adhesive is acidic. And over time, the piece of plastic that adhesive is holding to the paper is going to lift off, and it will no longer be sticky. Maybe not sticky enough to keep the plastic, but sticky enough to hurt its neighbor. So there's just a host of issues and problems that can come about after applying tape to an item. So best to leave taping and gluing to the professionals. When in doubt, leave it alone. That is the end of my slideshow of horrors. And now we'll go ahead and I wanted to address some of your questions that you had listed in your registration. And so if you have other questions, go ahead and jump in and we'll talk about them. The first question was about preserving newspaper clippings. And that is a really common question because newspaper clippings are beloved by so many and occur and show up in so many of our collections. But really, the newsprint itself was only designed to live for one day. When a newspaper is printed, another one is printed the next day, and no one in newspaper publishing is thinking about preservation or printing them on paper that's going to stand the test of time. So you'll see that they'll brown and get crumbly and very poor quality before other items in your collection. So I'm digging around in my folder. I have an example of, here's a newspaper from 1919. And it's so delicate that it could possibly just feather off if I touched it wrong on the end here. So really, the best thing to do in order to save this forever is to, sad enough to say, scan it and or make a photocopy, because the item itself is not really what you're preserving, it's the information. This is not a museum artifact. It is not inherently valuable because of its makeup. And so in order to preserve the information on this document, the best thing to do is really to make a copy of it, make a surrogate, and you can keep the original if you want to, or you can dispose of it because it's really not the item, it's the information. So with newspaper clippings, unfortunately, that's your best bet. I'm going to show you another example of how to preserve paper that is become crumbly. So I've been messing with this folder on the side. Here we go. Is that looking good, Patrick?
Yep, I can see it. Hopefully everyone else can see it too.
Okay. So you can see that there is this newspaper clipping. It's been sitting in this folder. And so we have acid migration happening with its neighbors. This page here has a nice brown square, and so does the one next to it, because of this offending newspaper clipping in the middle. So rather than take wild action against any of these items, the most simple solution for this is to take a piece of paper and just interleave it. Put these, they can even be on top of each other. They're not going to hurt each other any more than they already are. And then put another piece of paper on top of it. And now you've created a barrier. And so there will be no further damage. You don't have to move anything. You don't have to change or alter anything in this folder. So another option of a reversible action you can take on this newspaper clipping is to use a piece of archival polyester, polyethylene, polypropyl, otherwise known as Mylar. And so this is a package of L sleeves from Gaylord, and this is on the list of the supplies in your handout. This is one of the few items that is a specialized item that is really useful, but you want to be sparing with how you use these because they are not cheap. They can get expensive. But the best part about the L sleeve is that it comes open just on two sides. So that's why it's called L. And then you can just slip your items inside of it. And it's got a nice little natural static cling. So if you've ever worked with Mylar, you'll notice that it will just snug those documents right in there. So now these can hang out in this folder. They're not going to hurt their friends. And they're also protected themselves. That feathering isn't going to happen. This little piece of plastic is just going to save them from further damage and from harming their neighbors. So one of these packs of 10, this is an 8x10 L sleeve. I think the packages of 10 may run around $25 to $30. So you're looking at a significant cost, and you want to be sure that you choose wisely on how to use those pieces of Mylar in your collection. So that's also leads me to the second question, was how to stabilize. And this is really the best way to stabilize if you have the resources and if you're able to purchase some Mylar. I'm going to take this out because I don't really want to use this on this newspaper clipping. I'm going to go ahead and return to my interleaving. You may also notice that I don't have gloves on right now. And I'm going to take a moment to explain why, because what you just saw me do with the Mylar, I would not have been able to do if I was wearing cotton gloves. Losing the dexterity and the grip with your fingers can be more harmful to fragile documents when you're handling them if you have gloves on. If you really feel like you need to have gloves, wearing a nitrile glove is perfectly fine, but just having clean hands with no lotion is really the best way to handle paper items. So we're going to go with our interleaving. I'm actually just going to fold this guy in half. And so folding in half, that's going to give me a little pocket to keep that one in, so it's not going to fall out of the folder. And then it's not quite long enough for this one, so I'm going to go ahead with another sheet there. And that's going to be much better than it was before. So you can also stabilize with paper doing just that. Fold a piece of paper around it. This is also a way to avoid using a fastener. So this folder that we're looking at, I chose because it has so many different kinds of paper in it. My screen looks kind of green. You'll have to forgive me. I'm not sure what that's about. But I hope you can see the different colors of the paper that's in this folder, because there's a lot of different, with the telegrams and the onion skin. And then we have some more traditional. I'm sorry? Oh, is there a question? Nope. So all of these different colors of paper have different acid or alkaline qualities, and they may or may not need interleaving. They'll let you know, once again, with this acid migration, like you'll see on the edges of this page right here. So if you're processing and you see something like this, you can just go ahead and put a piece of paper in between there and interleave it. So here's another good reason not to use a fastener, is that they can make an indentation in your paper. But so instead of a paper clip, I can see that this is a 4-page letter that used to be paper clipped together. Someone took that clip out, probably a researcher, while they were using it. But what you can do, instead of using a plastic clip or a metal fastener, once again, just get yourself that piece of paper, and this can be an acid-free piece of paper or just regular copy paper. Fold it in half. And now you have a natural divider that is not creating a lot of bulk in your folder. It's not going to mess with its neighbors, and it's going to show you that all of these 4 pages go together without needing a fastener. And so if someone wants to make a copy or a scan of this item, it's also ready to go.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are you using a specific kind of paper to interleave between them, or is it just regular copy paper?
So you can use an archival acid-free bond. And it's a little bit more expensive than regular copy paper. But honestly, the paper that's produced today is treated to be mostly acid-free, and it will have a decent lifetime. So if you are on a budget and you've got copy paper, it is 100% better than nothing at all. This is a great question. Thank you. And that also brings me to a good example of showing this tool, which I like a lot. And I think this is about $6 or $8, and it's a pH pen. So it looks like a Sharpie, but it does something a little bit magical when you put it on paper. So this is a archival photo sleeve from Gaylord, just a little 4x5. So I'm gonna mark on it with the pH pen. So by this marking, I can see that it has a dot, which is showing up as purple. And on the pen itself, it gives me a guide where it says yellow is acidic and purple is neutral or alkaline. So I know by testing this with the pen that this envelope, this enclosure, is acid-free. So now here's our notebook paper, or our copy paper that I just put around that document. And it reacts in the very same way to the pH pen as the archival item. So using the pH pen, we can see that both of these are not acidic and that they're going to have the same type of barrier properties. This envelope is going to stay alkaline for longer than this piece of copy paper, but that is kind of negligible and really depends again on your budget and what you can do, because the ultimate goal of this whole hour is to not let perfect ruin good. So doing what you can is absolutely 100% better than doing nothing. And this is not going to harm anything by being in the folder, so I can just go ahead and leave it there. So as an example of something that is acidic, this folder here, I'm gonna go ahead and move this other guy out of the way so we don't get that. So this is an older folder that we have just removed from some documents while processing. And it's pretty brown. It's kind of blending in with the table right now, honestly. And the fun thing about this folder, and the reason why I brought it, is because you can see almost crystal clear the photograph that was in this folder, because the chemicals on that photograph have leached so perfectly into the folder that it is a copy of it. So we've refoldered these items, we've scanned everything. Ideally, that image would go in one of these sleeves that I've shown you, or you could just wrap a piece of paper around it, either way. So this folder is definitely acidic. I think we can assume that much. But we'll go ahead and give it a little circle with our marker. And because of the brown of the folder, it's probably hard to see that little circle there, but it's definitely not purple. It's going to be showing up as a yellow. So that's a good way to test things if you have items that you want to try to use as enclosures. I have a couple other examples of adhesive. This one is an example of some adhesive damage that you can see. There used to be a label here, and even though the label itself has fallen off, there's still some sticky goo that's on top of it. And rather than try and treat that or scrape it off or do anything with it, I'm gonna grab, you guessed it, a piece of paper. I'm gonna wrap that piece of paper right around it. And then I can put it back in the folder, I can put it back in the box, and it's safe and it's protected from its neighbors. And that piece of paper may eventually stick to this item, but that's gonna be better than harming its neighbors or just allowing this to be stick to something else, because that could possibly happen, or stick to the folder. So I love to use just regular paper as much as possible.
Jennifer,
From their neighbor.
there's a question in the chat. Jay asked, what are your tips and tricks for folded things like larger letter or thicker paper, like maps or ledgers? How do you get the fold out what if it's a large map that's been folded many times?
So for large items, you have a number of options when flattening things out. And I think there was a workshop earlier in this series about flattening rolled things. Folded items, you want to unfold it to its largest possible size and then store it flat. So like we had this newspaper that was in the folder here, and this is just a legal size folder. And this piece of newsprint, which I'm a little afraid honestly to unfold because it could fall apart. But it is a consideration when you're dealing with something. Every time that folds and unfolds, it's going to weaken that line. And so you don't want to keep anything folded that you don't have to keep folded. You really want to make it as big and flat as possible. So if we had a box, or we had a folder that would fit this whole thing, we would want to lay it flat. And as far as flattening something that's been folded, I would say there's really not a great way to do that unless you are comfortable humidifying. And that's a whole nother conversation about how to build a humidification chamber in a very gentle and controlled environment. But that being said, unfolding as big as you can is the best way to go. And if you don't have a box big enough, even if you have just a folder that's big enough, that would be useful. I also like to use, well, this one is flat, but if you have a box lid, kind of like a pizza box, you can use this as a stabilizer in between oversized items. So if you have something that you maybe put a couple pieces of paper on top of this, and then you put your item there, put another box lid, because for some reason, like, why do we always end up with extra lids, right? You run out of boxes and then you have this stack of lids. Do not ever throw them away. They're acid free. So use them to stabilize oversized things. I brought this as an example to talk about also making a spacer, which we'll do with another piece of cardboard. But that was a great question, Jay. Thank you. Oversized boxes can be really expensive and unfortunately sometimes necessary. And so if you know you have a collection that has a bunch of folded items and you want to try and get them into larger boxes, write that into your budget or make a special project where you can request for those funds specifically. And shop around because sometimes they'll have sales. So along with that, I will show you an example of the spacer that I was just talking about. I brought with me a box that has, here, we're going to scooch back again. Dun, 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 dun. Magic camera. I brought with me a box that has been faded in the sun. So at some point in its life, this box was exposed to UV light, and you can see that because it's kind of pink on the end. And the normal gray of the dock box is no longer gray. And in addition to that, it's only half full. So this box has items that have been slumping for I'm not sure how long, however long they've been in this box. So when I take this folder out, it's not going to be fun. When I take this folder out, it is curved, and it will remain curved unless I take some action to flatten it out. So not only is this unwieldy for me and the researcher, it's not great for the documents. So the folder is very bowed and the documents are very curled on one end. And this is all because the box just wasn't full. So when you're processing, you want to make sure that you fill the box 100% full, and that's either a dock box or a cubic foot box. And when I'm filling up a box, I like to, I'm going to pull the card up. Let's see if you can see that. Thanks for bearing with me and my camera angle changes, everybody. So when you're filling that dock box and you're processing, just hang it off the edge of something. If you have a table or a cart like this where you can put the box on the edge so the lid can fall down. And then you'll be sure, oh, these are so funky. I'm gonna pull them all out. You can be sure that when you put your folders in, they're gonna lay flat as possible. And then your next one is gonna go flat on top of it. Oh, now see, that's exactly what happens when they're not flat. They'll just fall out. So in
That was
order,
planned. Everyone, that was a planned reaction.
that was a plan. Exactly. Thank you. So when you're putting them in and you have all this room left, there are some really expensive and fancy items you can buy from Hollinger. They even printed their name on it. It says Hollinger Corp. And this is a cardboard spacer. It just looks like a big piece of cardboard because that's what it is. The reason you pay more for it is because it has scores on the paper on the cardboard right here that show you where to fold it. So as it turns out, you could make one of these, your very own, from a box lid, like we just looked at, or from just a regular piece of cardboard. And this is acid-free cardboard, which you can get in a pack of 20. I think it's called Bee Flute, and it's not super thick. But all you have to do is measure how deep you need that spacer to be and how long. So this is going to need to be at least this long because it's going to be the whole length of my box. I'm going to just take a pencil and mark on here how long that's going to be, marked to the box. And then for this way, you can just set it in there to the top of your folder and put a second mark to say it's going to have to be that deep. So when you have your two lines, we're going to use the edge of the cardigan. And you just take your line where you drew it and push that cardboard over the edge until you make a fold. And then you take it to the other side and make a fold. So now you have a little tiny table looking thing. And this is going to be a little too long for this box because I didn't trim it beforehand. But when you slide this in here, you want to put the flat side of your cardboard next to the documents and just slide it right in. So these are already folded, so they're kind of difficult. I've got to stick my hand in there to flatten it out. But now, when I stand this box up, the documents are all the way up and down. They're vertical in the box because it has the spacer to keep them standing up. So this will, over time, flatten them out. And all you had to do was take that piece of cardboard and fold it over on two sides. If it was longer, you could make it this way, which is how the store-bought version can go as well. So this one is going to be one fold, and then you'll do a second fold based on the depth of how far in it needs to go. So you just kind of check it out and see how much room you're going to need. And then you end up with this. So again, you're going to put this flat cardboard side against the documents and the open side against your box. Make sure that nobody falls out in the process. And then you have a spacer, which takes up the rest of the room in your box and ensures that your documents are going to stand straight up and down. So I showed you a funky box, and I also brought a nice one.
Jennifer, there was a question. You
Mhm.
mentioned the UV exposure on the other box. There's a question about, does fluorescent lighting, is that dangerous for paper items as well, or?
Yes, actually, it is not as bad as direct sunlight, but fluorescent bulbs can have the same effect as the sun because they do contain UV rays. LEDs are the best, and now that is becoming an affordable option. You can also get UV sleeves for fluorescent light bulbs if that's a thing that you're dealing with and you can't get LEDs, but most facilities are now open to moving toward LED lighting. The important thing to remember about that, and especially the box, is another good example of how the box will protect your documents. So whether we're talking about light or water or pests, the box is going to take the first hit, and that's what you want. That's what you're paying for. You're preserving the thing inside the box. So if that box takes the hit, the documents don't. So it's not to say that you're just throwing away boxes left and right, but just remember that that is your first line of defense. And especially if you're dealing with a water situation and you have a nice cubic foot box like this one, this will absorb a lot of water. And if you have documents in here and they get wet, this box is going to get pretty wet before anything inside of it does. And that gives you at least a little bit of time to hopefully get in there and get the stuff out of it. So this is your basic cubic foot box that the lid would fit on. And so this is a more ideal box situation. This one actually has a printed label on the outside and the hole. Some boxes will have, like this example, a little pull tab on the end of them instead of the hole. And some people have strong feelings about the differences here, like a bug's gonna crawl in there. Well, it could crawl in the lid just as well, I assume. I'm not sure that there's anything better or worse about a pull tab versus the hole in the box. It's really just for retrieval when you're pulling something down off the shelf. But so these are the letter size document cases. And this one has all of the folders standing nice and tall, evenly across. They're well spaced. They're not too tight because you can see the documents are a little wavy and had been folded or misshapen before. So it's a nice, comfortable situation where it's not too full, it's not too loose. You can pick one out and you can lift it up easily. If things are too tight in here, this can become difficult. And then you risk damaging the documents when you're pulling them out. Another thing to note about the scored folders when you are processing. Gonna do it. So yeah, it kind of see how that pulled 2 or 3 out at once. So this folder has been scored at the bottom. When it was folded and when it was filled, there are some pre-marked lines on the inside of each folder, and this one was actually scored in the middle. And that's to protect this edge. These are really crumbly, and it makes sense in the long term to do that. But you have to be careful because it makes it more difficult to get it out of the box then, because it's going to bow in and make this very flat bottom kind of like a edge on the other folders. So let me get this guy back in there. And so it is important when you're boxing to kind of, like I just did, you can put your hand in there, slide it in the front of the other one and just sort of feel and make sure that everything is up and down, because they're going to sit like this for the majority of their lifespan in the box. So I've shown you some good things, some bad things. I have a lot of examples. You've had a couple of questions. I wonder if there are more that I could answer. I also had an example of an encapsulated document that I wanted to show you. And so encapsulation is, I'm gonna hold it this way so it doesn't glare so badly. Encapsulation is when you place 2 pieces of mylar or plastic polyester around a document and you seal it on the edges using double-sided tape. So this double-sided tape is an adhesive. You want to give some room in between the document and the tape. And the thing about this that makes it okay is that it is 100% reversible. You can cut this plastic off and take this document out. But until that time, it's being stabilized and preserved in the plastic. So this is the alternative to laminating, which is a heat process that you don't ever want to do to a document, and it will forever be stuck in that plastic and you'll never get it out. And it will eventually all turn the color of that tape damage that we looked at. So other tools.
So Jennifer, I was just going to
Yeah.
ask, so what would be the incentive to encapsulate an item? Is it
The
important?
incentive-
Is it importance, significance to preserve it, or is it, because that's not something you're going to do to entire folder or entire collection. So what?
Oh,
what is-
absolutely. I see. Like, how would you choose which item to encapsulate versus another one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It would be importance of the item. If it's something you're going to show and tell a lot at your facility that you think you're going to pull. We chose to do this one as an example because it's a little bit oversized and it's a governor's proclamation, which we didn't have in this format for this governor previously. It's definitely something you would reserve for oversized, regularly used, or high profile material. It's also fun to find something that you can just practice on if you have the materials to do so. But the idea being, you're going to look for something like, here's a little shard. So someone's falling apart here. Telegram. So if you have an item like this and it's an important letter and you want to make sure that your two pieces stay together, you can choose to encapsulate it, or you can go back to that Mylar sleeve and you could just put those two pieces together in the Mylar sleeve together, which is going to save you some time and expense.
There's a question, does Mylar come in matte?
Matt, I don't
Right.
think so. I'm not, well, you can get, they're just like page protectors, like binder style page protectors, and those are not as shiny as these. So these look really silvery and they are quite reflective. The page protectors are more of a dull plastic, but these do come in different sizes. As you can see, this one is a smaller size if you had little items you wanted to put in here. But I don't believe it does. I will say that I have scanned items in Mylar before and it does okay. Sometimes you have to adjust the settings a little bit, but you can scan through it. I've used it for a roll through scanner and also a just flatbed. But there are archival page protectors that are scrapbook size. There are slide holders. There's all different postcard holders that you can put in binders, and you can get those from Gaylord as well. But again, those are going to be a little more expensive if you
Okay.
have a special collection that needs that type of treatment.
There was a question, and maybe it was answered already, but it was asking the difference in decision-making for encapsulation versus L sleeves. And maybe that was already answered, but I wanted to ask it just in case you had anything else to say.
No, I don't think that that specifically was talked about, but I think, honestly, I think it would be size more than anything, because like this item that is encapsulated, like we don't have any sleeves that are this big. And so we would have to use a piece of Mylar that was larger than this and cut out from it. So if anything was going to fit inside of that 8x10, I would definitely just put it in an L sleeve. I don't see a huge benefit to having something encapsulated. You also risk what's kind of happening here, which is if your document slides into the adhesive and gets stuck, then you have a repair situation to deal with when you were just trying to stabilize it in the first place. So I would always go with the L sleeve if you can, because any sort of exposure to adhesive is a potential for damage. So another thing you can purchase if you do get some oversized folders, folder board comes in 10 and 20 point weights. Most of your regular archival folders like these that I've been dealing with today, these are going to be a 10 point. This folder board here is 20, so it's a bit more sturdy, and it's good for some of those oversized items. You can cut this down to fit different sizes of things. And then if you do cut it down and you have a little strip left over, you can save that scrap because it can be used for any number of things, as like a bookmark or a placeholder, or it could even hold, it could act like a fastener, and you could put it around oversized items to designate a group of things. So I never throw even the smallest scrap away of folder board, folder, acid-free paper, or cardboard of any kind, because you can always find a use for it somewhere. I have an example of an enclosure that I made recently with one of our staff members here at the State Archives for an item that was in governor's papers, and it just was too big. We ended up just penciling on the end of it, which I prefer over sticky labels because pencil can't really fall off in the same way a sticky label can, and it's free or cheaper. So we just made this little enclosure with a simple flap out of folder board. And I actually just taped it together on the back. I know I said tape was bad, but it's on the outside of this folder enclosure that we made. And we put a piece of cardboard on the back of it to stabilize it in the bottom. So there's a number of items in here that were just a weird size. So they were in a box previously and had been getting curved because they were just too tall to fit inside that box. So we made this special folder for them. And this is another example of something that was just too long on each side of the legal size folder and just a smidge too tall on the top. So we took that item and laid it out on a box lid. You can see that's a box lid. It says in on it right there. So we laid down a box lid and we put our item on top of it, traced around the item, cut out this piece of cardboard. And then I actually made this little enclosure based on the size of the cardboard. So there are instructions online, a number of different places on how to make a 4-flap enclosure and a phase box. Again, I said I wasn't going to go into that today because it is a little bit more detailed. And this is kind of a modification of one of those where we just laid this square out and then kind of like a Christmas package wrapping, and just made this folder fit around it on all the sides. So you can have a little craft afternoon if you've got some supplies to burn and you want to try making something. It's going to be better off than it was before. Even if your enclosure is not 100% perfect, it's going to be better than squishing it into a box it doesn't fit into. And it may not be the most beautiful item you've ever made, but it's going to protect your materials. So don't be afraid to play and craft and cut and use your scraps. To make that flap, we did just with an X-Acto knife, made a little hole in it, and then just cut the top to have this loose piece that will just slide right in there. So that's an example of something you can make out of folder board. I think we have just a few minutes left. If anyone else has other questions or things that you want to talk about, if you have a specific issue. or something that I didn't discuss? So I did on the handout include some resources. I will highly recommend the Northeast Document Conservation Center. They have a Preservation 101 course on their website, which is a self-paced online course that is 100% free, and you can access that. They also have a great collection of preservation leaflets that talk about specific scenarios and different actions you can take on items in your collection. The Library of Congress and the National Archives also have a good amount of free materials on their websites too. So thank you all for being here. Are there any other questions or anything that we could talk about in our last couple of minutes? I made a big mess on my table. So the other couple things that we didn't talk about that I love to have as tools, I may have mentioned on the list, 18-inch metal ruler. This is really great, obviously, for measuring things, straight edge, folding that folder board if you're going to make your own enclosures. Also, cotton tying tape is really useful. These are not that expensive. I actually just bought some off of Amazon that was cheaper than what I purchased through Gaylord. And it seems to be just the same. It's bleached cotton, but I don't anticipate it's going to really hurt the outside of our ledgers that I wrapped these around. So you would use a cotton tape if you had something where the boards were loose from the book and you needed to make sure it stayed together. You could just do a Christmas wrapping type cross tie with this cotton tape, and then it could stay together just fine. Pencils, obviously, scissors, the white gum erasers. These are also a cheap item. I wanted to just kind of plug for, it will tell you your temperature and humidity in your storage area. They're not more than $20, and you just have to make sure you replace the battery every once in a while. It's a thing that you'll have to manually go check on, but it can tell you if you right away, if you're at 78% humidity, which you don't want to be, as an example on this box. But this one we got through Hollinger Metal Edge. So you can put that in your supply order with your paper and cardboard and other things. So. All right. Well, thank you everybody for being with me today and enjoying the facts and tips for paper preservation. If you have any questions or if there's anything that you'd like to follow up with me, I'm going to put my email in the chat. And so you're welcome to contact me anytime.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank
Wonderful
you.
presentation.